In underworld slang, Kirkman Nix was a contract man. He killed for money, according to police in the southeast. Another specialist, an alarm expert who could bypass the most complicated security systems money can buy, sometimes worked with a second burglar. Together they earned a grudging admiration from authorities for their expertise. Nix, an Oklahoman, was sentenced to life in a Louisiana prison for murder. The other two have served time for burglary and now face indictments on more than a dozen counts each of burglary in Fulton County. The three would probably be surprised to learn that police consider them fraternity brothers of a sort. In the eyes of the law, they belong to a disjointed organization called the Dixie Mafia, which has no headman, structure, or rules, and whose nomadic members are seldom aware of their status in it. In fact, the Dixie Mafia is not a mafia at all, only a title given to a conglomeration of southern criminals who find it wiser to stay on the move in these days of electronic law enforcement. They are a newspaper creation. Tagged the Dixie Mafia by a Dallas, Texas, reporter in 1968, the concept began drawing increased interest from police after authorities from several southern states started comparing notes and discovered that many of the same criminals were popping up with startling frequency. From Atlanta to Dallas to Miami, the names and faces began to blend into a recognizable picture. Authorities needed a name for this clique, and Dixie Mafia was as good as any. Their pattern of crime was hit and run. A local man would set up the job and then import the appropriate experts. The target was normally a bank, clothing store, warehouse, or loan company. After the crime, the money was split, and everyone scattered to a different state, often being flown out by friends who had private pilot licenses. It was this mobility that surprised police. Before, organized crime had a certain homemade, folksy quality about it that police could understand and usually control. 5 years ago, Mayor Ivan Allen Jr. described it like this: the organized crime leaders in Atlanta were concerned with only their respective corner of the block, dealing in terms of nickel and dime lottery tickets or $5 jugs of homemade whiskey, and were leery of anybody who was not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Georgian. Now it's different. Henry Hewitt, a special investigator for Fulton County District Attorney Lewis Slayton, has a bank of files devoted to the Dixie Mafia, which read like a shopping list of crimes. It is matched by similar files in other southern states, which all point out the recurring ease with which southern criminals now change their locales, crimes, and accomplices. Lieutenant H.R. Hancock, a longtime Dixie Mafia watcher with the Dallas Police Department, pointed out this new mobility, which stymies investigations. On March 27 of this year, there was a burglary at Maury's gift shop in Jackson, Miss, in which a load of expensive men's clothing was taken. Later that night, police arrested 3 men who were carrying luggage identical to some taken from the shop. All 3 were big-timers in the Dixie Mafia, Hancock said. One was William Huddleston, who had served time for burglary and theft by taking in 1971 in Georgia. Another was Jimmy Ray Graves, who operated out of Dallas, and the third was Ronald Smith, who is usually found in Arkansas. Huddleston's wife had departed for Atlanta before the law arrived, but was traced to Miami and later to South Carolina. When the Mississippi police searched Huddleston's car, they found a radio scanner tuned to police channels and some transmitters of the type used for short-distance communication. In the trunk, they also found some clothing stolen the week before from a Memphis store, Hancock said. When the 3 were released on bond, Huddleston returned to Atlanta. Smith dropped from sight, and Graves showed up in Kansas, where he was jailed for burglary of a safe. He later was charged with the murder of an army sergeant who had witnessed an armory being robbed in Louisiana. The point here is that in talking about only 4 people in the space of a few days, we've traced their activities across 9 states. It takes organization and teamwork to move that often and that fast, Hancock said. What's the difference then between the Dixie Mafia and the more infamous Godfather families headquartered on the East Coast? Discipline, says Hewitt. The Cosa Nostra is regimented like an army, and they never take on anything unless the top man knows about it. They're disciplinarians, and the Dixie Mafia are anything but. The Cosa Nostra, as authorities now know it, is efficiently divided into families, regiments, and territories with an established chain of command. While burglaries and robberies are the mainstay of the Dixie Mafia, they are frowned upon by the Cosa Nostra, who prefer organized gambling, prostitution, drugs, and legitimate business fronts to invest their earnings in. With increasing frequency, however, the Dixie Mafia and the Cosa Nostra have been crossing paths and intermingling their activities. A local man with stolen goods may fence them through a Cosa Nostra dealer. Gambling rings managed by the Dixie Mafia may turn to their better-financed counterparts to cover a large wager. In return, the Cosa Nostra uses local talent to do the legwork involved in laying bets. So, while individuals may be pegged as Cosa Nostra or Dixie Mafia, their activities are not so easily labelled. Crime is crime, whoever commits it, and it is only natural that these two underworld factions would have a vague partnership, if for no other reason than a practical business arrangement. Slayton, who set up a special intelligence division 18 months ago to study organized crime, is convinced, however, that the Dixie Mafia has no links with the Cosa Nostra. I think the only real mafiosi we have in Atlanta are the small-timers. They may have connections to New York and Detroit, but they themselves are far down the line, Slayton said. But if they ever did decide to make a real effort here, the Dixie Mafia would provide some fertile recruiting ground. These local boys have plenty of muscle and artillery, so it would make good sense to talk to them. But right now, they're about as far apart as they can get. Hewitt thinks the first feeler from the East Coast may have come in the person of Tommy Gambidora in 1969. Gambidora tried to set up a credit card ring, but was arrested and served a sentence here before returning to the Colombo family in New York. He was later gunned down on a sidewalk there when Colombo began warring with some of the other families. Two other Cosa Nostra soldiers with Atlanta ties have met similar fates. McKinley Rogers and Donald Phillips, who police think staged the hold-up of a celebration party on Handy Drive after the Muhammad Ali Jerry quarry fight here in 1970, were found murdered a year later in the Bronx. Killing is a common denominator between the Dixie Mafia and the Cosa Nostra. It is a business tool for both, but rarely used on each other, simply because at present they don't have conflicting interests. But even in homicide, they differ. For example, in 1970, detectives discovered the body of Dunaway, a suspected Dixie Mafia member, stuffed in a barrel at the Atlanta airport. Police later found that Dunaway had been in Tennessee for a time, apparently hiding from the Mafia. But someone found him. The case is unsolved. Also a mystery is the death of Kenneth Jap Hanna, believed to be a member of the Cosa Nostra, who ended his career locked in a car trunk at the airport in 1970. The only thing investigators can agree on about Dunaway and Hanna is that they were done in by professionals. Atlanta is not the only dumping ground for bodies. In 1968, a part-time pimp and burglar from Atlanta, named L.B. Kelly, was found nude in a desert outside Denison, Texas, with 15 bullet wounds in his head and chest. A year before, another Atlanta man, Eddie Grant Lewis, was found shot in the head in a car parked on an Ohio expressway. Both were known members of the Dixie Mafia. Reports of many of the other killings read like cheap crime magazine stories. Lee Bowling, former policeman turned crook, found dead in a prostitute's apartment in 1971. The same apartment complex was later the home of Brian Gerald Haynes, a more recent victim. Leroy Kerwin, an Atlanta business executive with suspected underworld connections, found shot to death in Canada. Jack Howard Joy, who robbed a friend of New Orleans Cosa Nostra, Chief Carlos Marcello, and was shot to death and set aflame. Winton Farley, small-time burglar whose body was cut in half and placed in separate laundry bags in Mississippi in 1970, and Clifford B. Fitzwilliams, who was apparently still alive when handcuffed to a boat anchor and dumped into the Freeport Textor Bay. The most recent contract slayings involved an Atlanta ex-convict named Brian Gerald Haynes, whose slashed and decomposing body was found crumpled in the bottom of a North Fulton County well on May 31st. His legs were bound with adhesive tape, and there were knife wounds in his back and neck, a trademark police now know well. When a list of Haynes's friends and associates was drawn up by Slayton's office, it read like a who's who in the Dixie Mafia. 3 of them were identified by informants as having been with Haynes the day he died. Authorities are now seeking them for questioning. Speculation is that Haynes was murdered because his killers thought he was talking to the Fulton County District Attorney. The District Attorney's office admitted they had questioned Haynes when he was serving a term for a 1969 robbery conviction. He didn't talk, they said. They admitted that the Underworld might have mistakenly assumed that. Haynes's death reawakened interest in the Mafia and spotlighted again one of its more colourful characters. Sonny Paris, alias Sonny Parish, whom one detective describes as a gutsy hood with the ugliest face I know. First reports had placed Sonny near the Haynes home when he disappeared, but authorities have now discounted that theory, believing that Sonny was too busy robbing banks. As bank robbers in the Dixie Mafia go, Sonny Paris is among the best, and lately he's been breaking all track records for hold-ups. His most recent exploits began in March of this year, when he was in jail again for a robbery and was taken to Hewat's office for questioning on another case. When Hewat turned his back, Sonny whipped out a long-barreled .38 caliber pistol from his boot. It was twice the size of mine, Hewat recalled. After forcing his way out of the office, Sonny reacted like an old firehorse. 10 minutes later, he was at the Mercantile National Bank, pistol in hand, declaring a stick-up. Adding insult to injury, he repeated the hold-up at the same bank the following day and yelled to tellers, "I'm the same bastard that robbed you yesterday, and I'll do it again tomorrow." He didn't, however, much to the disappointment of a small army of police waiting in ambush. Since then, Paris has remained on the move. In late May, he robbed a bank in Nashville, Tennessee, this time working with a girl accomplice who later was captured. She had a picture of Sonny in her purse, but claimed she never knew him by that name and had met him in New York. Later reports placed him in Florida, and even later in Savannah, but it wasn't until June 8th that Sonny ended the guessing game on his whereabouts by showing up donned in a wig and makeup to rob the First Bank of Georgia on Peachtree Street. With mobility like that, Paris and the rest of the Dixie Mafia have forced authorities to do a little organizing of their own. In 1968, the Southern Regional Intelligence Council was formed and met in Atlanta for the first time. Lawmen compared notes, listened to speeches, and huddled for long hours over each other's files. Because of scheduling problems, the council has not met for more than 6 months, and Hewat thinks it's about time they did. One department or even one state can't keep up with these guys. As soon as they feel the heat here, they just move someplace else. We get reports one day from Florida, and the next from Tennessee. Who knows what they're planning, he said.